1968. On the afternoon of April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped outside of room 306 at the Lorraine Hotel. He stepped outside of room 306 at the Lorraine Hotel. He was on the second floor. And there's a hotel in town that looks a little bit like it, that's kind of behind the old Cross Feeds. Seen that? And it has the balcony on top, the second floor. You can step out of your room onto the balcony. And that's what Dr. Martin Luther King did on the afternoon of April 4th, 1968, is he stepped outside of his room, 306 at the Lorraine Hotel. He was on the hotel balcony outside of his room because he wanted to get some fresh air. And he stood alone on the balcony, and he noticed some friends below on ground level. So he leaned over to speak to his friends that were on ground level at the Lorraine Hotel. So as he stood alone on the balcony, he noticed some friends below on ground level and began to speak to them. Suddenly, approximately 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, a single rifle shot rang out in the Memphis sky. Suddenly, at approximately 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, April 4th, 1968, a single rifle shot rang out in the Memphis sky. Dr. King was shot. He was hit in the neck, and the single bullet tore away the right side of his jaw. He was hit in the neck, and the bullet tore away the right side of his jaw. Several of Dr. King's aides rushed to his side, with several of them pointing in the direction in which they thought the shot came from. Several of Dr. King's aides rushed to his side, with several pointing in the direction in which they thought the shot came from. Within 15 minutes of the single shot fired, Dr. King was rushed to Memphis's St. Joseph's Hospital, where doctors desperately tried to save his life. Within 15 minutes of the shooting, Dr. King was rushed to Memphis's St. Joseph's Hospital, where doctors desperately tried to save his life. At 7:05 p.m. Central Standard Time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead at the age of 39. At 7:05 p.m. Central Standard Time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead at the age of 39. As I mentioned briefly yesterday, news of Dr. King's death set off rioting and violence in 40 cities across the United States. Violent riots. So news of Dr. King's death set off urban rioting and violence in 40 cities across America. Now picture this scenario. We haven't got this yet, but we will. Robert Kennedy is campaigning for the presidency. He's going to try to get the Democratic nomination to run for president in 1968. And he is giving a speech in Indianapolis, Indiana. And he hears this. And most of the crowd he's talking to is black. And he stops his speech. This tells you how great of an orator he was. He stops his speech, and he is the one that breaks the news to the crowd in Indianapolis that Dr. King has been shot and killed. I'm going to read it to you because it's incredible. He didn't have a speech written for this. He didn't have any idea it was going to come. This is what he said. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm only going to talk to you just a minute or so this evening because I have some very sad news for all of you. Could you lower those signs, please? Because he had people, cheering for him. I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. You can imagine the reaction. He continues, Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness, with hatred, and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and whites among whites, filled with hatred towards one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that has spread across our land, with an effort to understand, compassion, and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to fill with or be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart that same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond those rather difficult times. So I ask you tonight to return home, to say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King, and yeah, it's true, but more importantly, to say a prayer for our country, which all of us love, a prayer for understanding and that compassion of which I spoke. Who gives a speech like that, off the cuff? Incredible. And I think what really calmed him was the fact that he stated that he too also had a family member killed, and that person was killed by a white person. Well, from Washington, D.C., President Johnson had to address the issue, and he also spoke to the American people, and he ended his speech by urging American citizens to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King. So from Washington, D.C., President Lyndon Johnson also spoke to the American people, urging citizens to, quote, reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King. Police would immediately launch one of the biggest manhunts in American history. In addition, they would offer a $100,000 reward, which would be about $700,000 in today's money, for any information that would lead to the capture or the conviction of King's assassin. And you know what that is, don't you? A whole other story, which I am going to save you the note writing and give you. Now, I'd like you to spend the rest of this period reading through this. Those of you that are going to be gone the next few days, make sure that you read this and go through it. We will go through it quickly tomorrow, but I do want you to be prepared tomorrow and know what we're talking about before we start the lecture. So I'd like all of you to take the rest of the period. This is the search for the assassin of Martin Luther King Jr., an unusual story in itself. Yeah. No, I decided we'll just keep them. Just keep them and study off them. I'm pretty sure if you wrote down what I said, you probably got it, don't you? Yeah. Okay. So make sure you understand those, because that will be on the test. Here we go. I'd like you to spend the rest of the period reading The Search for the Assassin of Martin Luther King Jr., and then we will discuss it tomorrow in a faster motion than we would if we were lecturing and you had to take the notes.